Have you ever wondered how the U.S. Navy fought the carrier at the beginning of World War II in the Pacific? Oh, I'm curious. So let's take a look at the first U.S. carrier airstrikes in the Pacific War. Stick with us on Flywire. Hi, I'm Scott Perdue, and today on Flywire, we're going to take a look at the first combat airstrikes flown by offensive airstrikes flown by the Enterprise and the Yorktown in World War II. I'm not going to delve into the grand strategy in this video. You know, I did talk about that some in the Battle of Midway series that I did, a two-parter. But what really interests me here is the state of tactics at the beginning of the war, its effectiveness, and then how it developed throughout the war. I think that's fascinating. And so we're going to look at that. Military tactics are usually the lowest thing on the priority list. Tactics is how you employ the forces you have to achieve the objectives set for you against the enemy that confronts you. In a nutshell, it is the smaller combat units from brigade, regiment, down to the infantry squad, or even for the Navy, the carrier and its airplanes, not the higher units, and not national for sure. An important point is that in any military, in any country, without a clear and present threat or the understanding of it, the military will fall into a rut of past practice and self-reference. They always prepare to fight the last war they're involved in and think that's good for the future. France and Britain at the beginning of World War II are perfect examples. They were prepared to fight the Germans in trench warfare from World War I and had not considered that the Germans had changed the world with the Blitzkrieg. The U.S. military had definitely fallen into the rut prior to World War II, and the Navy had even though the Navy had the foresight to pursue carrier operations, and they were at the forefront of a developing naval aviation, still, to all intents and purposes, it was a battleship Navy at the beginning of the war. Fleet training exercises concentrated on strategy and tactics centered around the gun. And that's what they had always done, so why should it be different now? When the Japanese took out the American battleships during the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Navy could no longer organize their tactical fleets and plans around the battleship. Their loss forced the Navy's hand, and battleships were the old and slow. Then the battleships were the old and slow compared to the U.S. fleet carrier. At the beginning of World War II, so at the beginning of World War II, a carrier task force was generally made up of one carrier and 3 heavy cruisers, 7 or more destroyers. The fleet command still centered on the battleship. The Japanese were the same way. By the end of the war, fleet commands were centered on a force of several carriers with fast battleships added for protection, primarily in the anti-aircraft fleet defense role. So the task force, here's the interesting thing, I think, is the task force commanders were mainly non-pilots, and with the exception of Bull Halsey, who did go to pilot training late in his career, they made their flagships one of the cruiser escorts and not the carrier. In my opinion, this distancing affected the course of the early battles in unfortunate ways. But that's beyond the scope of this particular video. Suffice it to say that the Navy would pay the price for several years for favoring the gun over the carrier. And some of them there were pretty disastrous ways. The Japanese also favored the gun over the carrier, but they used the carrier, and they saw carrier aviation as an offensive weapon, and they enthusiastically embraced mass. This offensive mindset ran totally counter to the U.S. naval attitude, and the Japanese organized their carrier forces into divisions of 2 carriers and employed those as mobile forces of 4 to 6 more carriers, all dedicated to coordinated mass strikes. For the first 6 months of the war, their attacks were devastating. What I find interesting is the fact that fleet training exercises did not develop tactics and procedures to employ the weapons the aircraft on board the carrier represented that they could do. Exercises became set-piece events that largely confirmed the battle plans and strategies that commanders started with. For example, the 1929 Pacific Fleet problem saw the fast carrier Saratoga, capable of more than 30 knots, race ahead of the task force battleships, who were limited to 23 knots. They launched a devastating dawn strike on the Panama Canal with 83 airplanes. But the referees ruled that the Saratoga was sunk The battleship officers believed that their ships would be the decisive players, and they had to make it that way. Through the fleet exercises in the 1930s, the carrier aviators began to realize the potential of their offensive weapon intellectually, but not actually how to employ it. They realized the vulnerability of the carrier was when it was tied to battleships and the tactical imperative to destroy the enemy's carriers. And that was the focus of virtually all of their employment strategy. Admittedly, part of the problem was battleship armor. For most of the 1930s, they were not threatened by bombs that biplanes could carry. But then the SPD Dauntless dive bomber in the late 1940s was equipped with 500 and 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs, and that was the end of the invulnerable battleship. In 1940, the Navy reorganized their fleets into battle forces, and the carriers were then separated from the battleships. But the existential threat posed by an opposing carrier led the Navy to add a scouting squadron of SBDs, and they equipped those with bombs to immediately attack an enemy carrier when sighted. The unfortunate issue here is that the potential power and procedures of putting together a coordinated strike and the effect of that coordinated strike that combined all the dive bombers and torpedo planes and fighters aboard the carrier was not developed in the U.S. Navy as an offensive weapon. The Saratoga strike of the Panama Canal was not a learning point, and this was a critical pre-war mistake that wasn't rectified until 43, maybe. The tactical battle plan of U.S. Navy carrier aviation was defensive in nature and disposed to attack with what they had available right now, believing time was the crucial factor, not mass. Air power is flexible and powerful, but it is easily misunderstood. And what we have learned is employing air power in mass is a very difficult thing to accomplish, and experience has shown time and again that air power is ineffective in piecemeal attacks. Perhaps the biggest lesson to be learned here in this particular battle was that the fighter mission aboard the carrier. If you considered how to defend the carrier, the fleet as a whole, as well as attacking dive bombers and torpedo planes. The aircraft breakdown aboard the Enterprise for the first combat cruise of the war was 36 SPD dive bombers, split evenly between bombing and scouting squadrons, and 18 TBD torpedo bombers, and 18 F4F fighters, except they also flew the Buffalo early. Enterprise headed to war in the Pacific and promptly lost 2 SPDs and 1 TBD to operations in the outbound lane. The Yorktown had 38 SPDs, 12 TBDs, and 14 F4Fs, having lost 3 fighters in takeoff accidents and 1 damaged in a landing barrier arrestment before this particular battle on 1 February. Carrier ops were a dangerous thing to do in peace or war. So let's turn to that first offensive combat cruise of the carriers in the Pacific. The Navy was anxious to get started, but was very cautious with the few assets that it had left after Pearl Harbor. Carriers were precious. They were itching for a fight, but they wanted to control the risk of their first encounters. So the Navy High Command settled on the idea of raiding outlying Japanese bases to force the Japanese to stretch their occupation forces and inflict some damage. Task Force 8, with Halsey aboard the Enterprise, planned to coordinate dawn strikes against Japanese bases at Jalawit and Mili atolls in the southern Marshall Islands and Macon Atoll in the northern Gilberts. 1 February was set as the date for that attack. Nimitz, the commander-in-chief in the Pacific and Hawaii, modified that mission on the 27th of January to include Kwajalein, Meliolap, and Wochi atolls to follow up airstrikes with ship bombardment. Halsey passed his original targets to Fletcher, in command of the Yorktown, Task Force 17, trailing 150 miles behind the Enterprise. After replanning the attacks to include the new target sets, Wilmer Gallagher, the XO of Scouting 6, flew to the Yorktown to brief the revised plan. Japanese air defense in the region was an understrength detachment of the Japanese Navy 24th Air Flotilla. This was due in part because they had shifted airplanes to support the Japanese attacks on Rabaul that had begun just days prior to the end of January. The force comprised 33 Type 96 fixed-gear carrier fighters. They weren't A6M0s. They had 9 land attack planes and 9 flying boats. The flying boats performed long-range search and patrol missions. After dark, the Enterprise split off the bombardment groups and increased speed to 30 knots, heading to the midpoint between the islands for the dawn strike. Kwajalein Atoll was considered the most dangerous target. It was 155 miles away, and the attack group there would be 37 SPDs and 9 TBDs. The remaining 9 TBDs would be held in reserve. Wochi and Taroa would each be attacked by 6 F-4S Fighting Six carrying 100-pound bombs. McCluskey, commander of VF-6, would lead the attack on Wochi, only 36 miles away. And you might have remembered McCluskey. We would meet him later as the Enterprise Carrier Air Group commander for the Midway battle. Jim Gray would lead the other 6 F-4S to attack Taroa and Melalap Atoll 100 miles away. The remaining 6 F-4S would serve as combat air patrol to protect the carrier. Wochi would be shelled then by after the attack, would be shelled by 2 heavy cruisers and 1 destroyer under Admiral Spruance, and then Taroa would be shelled by the heavy cruiser Chester and 2 destroyers. The plan was that the follow-up shelling would render any surviving Japanese airplanes unflyable. That was the idea. The effectiveness of Navy bombardment was greatly overestimated, and this is actually a factor that would persist throughout the war, for landings as well. On 1 February 1942, Enterprise woke the aviators at 0300, that's 3 a.m., and pretty damn early. Flight quarters were then sounded at 3:45. So let's look at that Enterprise strike first. The F-4F cap and 36 SPDs of the Kwajalein attack group took off as the first deck load beginning at 04:45. The second deck load of 9 TBDs and 1 SPD that had fixed engine problems took off shortly after 0500. The next 2 strikes, with shorter distances to fly, waited almost an hour. All of the remaining F-4S had been armed with 200-pound bombs. And then Gray, leading the Taroa attack group, took off next at 0610, suffering 1 F-4F lost on takeoff when Dave Criswell stalled right after takeoff and then crashed into the ocean on his first night takeoff. At 0616, McCluskey's attack group took off for Wochi. The first wave of 58 airplanes were airborne, and attacks were timed to hit all 3 targets simultaneously at 0700 sunrise. The Wochi attack flight climbed to 10,000, and at 0658 and then at 0658 immediately pitched over into a high-speed bombing run. Each fighter dropped 100-pound bomb on the first pass on buildings clustered around one end of the airstrip. On the second pass, the fighters began strafing runs. By 0714, they were through and headed home with the bombardment beginning behind them. They had suffered no damage. Okay? Taroa attack flight, however, they climbed to 15,000 feet, and at 0640, Gray identified Melalap Atoll, and he gave this single signal to attack the nearest island. The first 2 F-4S dropped 1 bomb, and during the pullout realized that they had bombed the wrong island. The other 3 in the flight aborted their runs, and they climbed back up to about 5,000 feet, and then Gray saw the right island, Taroa, to the southeast, and he pushed it up and headed to the target. And that strung all 5 F-4Fs out in trail. They were not organized. It's just fastest man gets there. Damn, let's go. Approaching Taroa, they realized that it was a well-equipped airfield complex, and Gray noted numerous enemy aircraft, some of them twin-engine bombers. That was that 9 land attack planes. At the same time, the Japanese lookouts had spotted the inbound bombardment group, highlighted by the rising sun, and they had scrambled 3 fighters to intercept. Lieutenant Rawi in the second F-4F spotted 2 fighters of the morning patrol in front and slightly higher, headed out to the approaching warships. Passed them by. At this point, the strung out F-4Fs had not been spotted on their way into the target. Gray and Rawi dived in on the parked airplanes, dropped their bombs, and began strafing. Okay. On the pullout from the dive, Rawi was low and fast, and he turned north then, and he spotted 2 Japanese fighters that had just scrambled for takeoff, headed the same way. They were going to the warships. The Japanese were unaware that there were American fighters in the area. Rawi pushed up the power and closed on the formation from below and to the right. Once when he was in range, he put a long burst into the lead fighter, setting it on fire. The pilot, Lieutenant Kurikane, who was the senior pilot present, rolled his stricken airplane and bailed out. He survived. The burning fighter crashed into the water, and Chester the heavy cruiser and the bombardment group, witnessed the first victory scored by a U.S. Navy fighter pilot in World War II. Pretty impressive that they were actually there and could see it. Carrying his speed, Rawi pressed on ahead and then did a hook turn to make a head-on pass at the wingman, who was, I think, Petty Officer 3, Ataki. Both pilots refused to give way, and they pressed the attack. Rawi struck the fighter's wing with the underside of his F-4F. The mid-air collision sheared off one of the antennas and dented the fuselage of the Grumman, but otherwise it wasn't hurt. Ataki's fighter, on the other hand, had suffered a crumpled wingtip, some wing damage, and the aileron was nearly torn off. Unable to fly, he started to set it down immediately. Rawi didn't see that. He continued straight ahead to strafe the airfield again. When his guns jammed, which just after he started the strafe, he aborted his attack on the airfield, only to be jumped by another Japanese fighter. And using his superior speed, he left the attacker and flew into the clouds, making his way home after he was sure he wasn't being followed. The remaining F-4Fs dropped their bombs into the parked airplanes and began strafing. The Japanese succeeded in launching 5 more fighters by 07:15. The F-4Fs all experienced jam guns and tangled with the Japanese fighters on the way out of the target area. Gray was absorbed in making 3 deliberate strafing runs. He's focused before he spotted enemy fighters. At 07:18, with one gun working, he attacked a fighter attempting to make a downwind landing. He noted that it appeared to crack up on the runway, and it was actually likely Ataki after landing his aileron fell off. That's what the Japanese report said. By this time, Gray was the only F-4F, and all the Japanese fighters were concentrated on him. He countered each pass and did not try turning with any of his attackers, dodging one head-on, and then he dodged one doing a head-on pass, and then he saw another one right directly in front of him, and he took a good snapshot on his way out of the fight. He had soaked up about 30 or 40 hits on his way home. The makeshift armor plate behind his seat that they did right before the trip, the fight, that likely saved his life. He wasn't originally equipped with armor. The Enterprise CAG, Commander Young, led the attack group over Roy at about 6:53 without identifying it. That alerted the Japanese, and at 7:15 he finally identified the target and directed Scouting 6 to make the first attack. Japanese fighters had started taking off to intercept them. One of these slipped behind the skipper of Scouting 6 and shot him down as he recovered from the dive. Fighters scored another SPD, and the flak shot down still another in that first wave. Scouting 6 lost a 4th SPD when the pilot ditched just north of Roy. At 7:27, Young directed Bombing 6 and the TBDs to attack shipping at anchor in the Kwajalein Lagoon. One of the TBDs had mistakenly identified 2 of those ships as carriers. Hearing that Enterprise immediately, on the radio, they were listening, they immediately launched 9 TBDs with torpedoes. That second strike reached the target long after the first attack group had gone, and luckily, there were no Japanese fighters covering the ships at anchor at Kwajalein. When the Taroa F-4S began landing at 0800, Halsey then interviewed Rawi, he was the first one to land, about what they had found. He was determined, Halsey, to destroy the target, and so Enterprise launched a second strike on Taroa at 0935 with 9 SPDs and no fighter support. Enterprise launched a third strike of 9 SPDs for Taroa at 1035, led by Lieutenant Dick Best. We know him from Midway too. The fighters shot down 1 SPD from this group, and Best crews claimed 2 Japanese fighters. Enterprise launched another strike of 8 SPDs and 9 TBDs at 11:16, aimed at Wochi's shipping. By 12:35, that attack was over with no American losses. The Japanese bombers then attacked the Chester. They had attacked the Chester, had launched and attacked the Chester. And they waited out the additional American strikes on Taroa, waiting impatiently to land and refuel and rearm in order to then attack the carrier. All 8 had been damaged. And on landing, 1 was determined to be unserviceable. 2 others required additional work prior to launch. Nakai, the bomber's lead, took off with 5 airplanes and began searching for the carrier. At 13:30, Nakai found the Enterprise near Wochi. The Japanese did not possess radar, but the Americans did. And that was fortunate. But the unfortunate thing was that none of the airplanes at IFF, Identification Friend or Foe, equipment, and Commander Dow, the fighter director, he had a hard time identifying who was enemy and who was friendly. The interception in this case was left to the, actually even detecting it was left to the sharp eyes of the cap. Rawi, flying cap, picked up the Japanese bombers and then Dow vectored 2 flights of F-4Fs towards the contact. The cap picked up the attackers at 10,000, about 15 miles from the carrier. The F-4Fs attacked and again jammed guns became a problem for the F-4Fs. 6 F-4Fs attacked the formation, only 2 were able to fire, and those both concentrated on Nakai, the leader of the formation. Approaching the carrier, anti-aircraft flak began shooting, and they underestimated the speed of the bombers. They were fast. So their fire was actually directed on the friendly F-4Fs in trail of the bomber formation. So the fighters pulled off the pursuit. The Enterprise then pushed it up to 30 knots and began making hard turns to spoil the aim of the Japanese bombers. They released their bombs at 1338 at 3,000 feet, and then they pulled out at 1,500 feet, screaming right over the carrier. All their bombs missed, with only one starting a small fire as it exploded near the ship. As the bombers headed away, Nakai turned back with the intention, apparently, to crash into the carrier. At the last moment, the carrier turned hard right and spoiled the bomber's aim. The right wing of the bomber scraped the left edge of the carrier flight deck opposite the island and broke the tail off an SPD. The bomber's right wing broke off and then fell onto the flight deck, spraying everything with fuel and starting a fire. It was handled fairly quickly. The 2 remaining Japanese bombers left Taroa at 1430, closing to 25 miles from the carrier at 1530. Making a level attack, the F-4Fs again sheared off because of U.S. flak. Some hits were made on one of the bombers and no damage was done to the carrier. Catching up with the bombers on egress, the F-4Fs shot one down and damaged the other one. They weren't being harassed by Enterprise flak. The Enterprise escaped Japanese pursuit by taking cover, then they escaped pursuit by taking cover under a weather front, and there the first U.S. Navy carrier raid of the Pacific War was over. Overall, the box score of the Enterprise air groups: 3 gunboats, 1 freighter sunk, 10 ships, including a light cruiser, damaged for the loss of 5 aircraft. And the first U.S. Navy fighter kills of the war. Fighting 6 claimed 5 enemy aircraft shot down, 3 fighters and 1 float plane, and 2 bombers. Losses were 1 F-4F and pilot lost on takeoff, and then 2 were damaged. 5 SPDs were lost, but 6 claimed enemy fighters, they claimed 6 enemy fighters shot down at Troy and Taroa. One of the big lessons was that 18 fighters wasn't enough. Beginning with 18 F-4Fs, by sunset there were only 14 serviceable on Enterprise. Problems with gun failures were traced to heavy belts of 50 caliber ammunition shifting under aggressive maneuvering. They hadn't figured that out because in pre-war maneuvers the F-4Fs only carried about 70 rounds per gun, so they didn't reveal the problem. The fighters did not have self-sealing fuel tanks. There was no armor for the engine or the pilot, and they didn't have incendiary bullets available, so making a strafing pass less effective. They didn't only set 1 airplane on fire. No IFF gear made identifying enemy aircraft hard amongst all the returning friendly aircraft, and that was a problem. VF-6 did not think much of the fighter opposition, which they perceived as lacking aggression, and that the planes were inferior to the F-4F. They did turn better. They thought some of those Japanese fighters were zeros, when in actuality they didn't face any zeros at all. The flush of battle and perceived success did not force them into a sober review of their tactics. In other words, they didn't learn anything by their attacks and how they progressed. The Yorktown had 3 targets assigned, and in the run toward the launch point, they pressed further and further into bad weather. The plan, like the Enterprise, was to hit all 3 targets simultaneously at 7 in the morning. Launching air strikes, they headed east to recover away from the targets. All the F-4Fs of Fighting 42 were retained to protect the task group. There were no fighters at the targets. At 0452, they launched the cap, and then at 0515, the Jalaloid attack group of 17 SPDs and 11 TBDs. They experienced trouble getting all the attackers in formation, so they just proceeded the target in small groups and even individuals. At 5:37, Scouting 5 took off with 9 STBs to Macon, and at 0604, 5 SPDs headed for Millie. The Jalaloid attackers had to slog through bad weather all the way to the target. They were unable to form up, and low clouds forced them to extremely low altitudes. 2 SPDs, they just simply disappeared. Nobody heard from them again. Torpedo 5 lost 4 TVDs, 2 of which ditched near the target. Make and Strike burned 2 flying boats and damaged an auxiliary vessel. The Millie Strike found nothing of interest. The weather turned worse throughout the recovery. They even landed the cap because of the weather after a float plane and another SPD was lost. At 11:17, destroyers searching for a downed aircrew spotted a Japanese flying boat looking for the task force. The Yorktown then launched 6 S-4Fs to chase him down. Losing contact, they reestablished the cap. At 13:05, another report of the snooper over the destroyers brought the attention of the cap, and 2 F-4Fs caught it in the clear and damaged it. They followed it into a cloud, and then one shot at the flying boat from underneath and the other one from the tail, and they flamed the snooper, and the violent explosion tore it all apart, and all of that was in the full view of the ship. Pretty amazing. With the terrible weather and the approaching darkness, Fletcher decided to refuel his destroyers and attack the next day. That evening, Halsey ordered everyone to withdraw. So, that was the end of the strikes. The box score for Yorktown was damage to 7 auxiliary ships with the loss of 8 aircraft. Enterprise returned to Pearl on 5 February, and the Yorktown made it on the 6th of February. From a tactical standpoint, I'd like to do a hot wash of this first combat raid by the Navy in the Pacific. We've done a bit of that as we went along, about how it progressed. And, war is one of those things that's a come as you are kind of thing. The people and equipment you have against the enemy that is there. You throw everything into the fray and hope for the best. The best you can really hope for here is that you'll survive long enough to figure out how to fight this guy before he wipes you out. You do the best you can. At the beginning of World War II, the U.S. military was unprepared to fight a modern war. That wasn't the guy in the cockpit's fault or the guy at the AAA gun either. The equipment is either old and nearly obsolescent, like the TVD, or relatively new and untested, like the F-4F. The people were largely untrained in realistic tactics and few had experience in combat-oriented operations in any case. We will see in future videos in this series that there were some extraordinary aviators and surface sailors in the wings that will turn the tide. And Jimmy Thatch was one in the Midway video. You got to watch that. He was one of the brilliant guys. There was one thing that the U.S. Navy fighter pilots did that prepared them for war in a way that no other Allied, Japanese, or German fighter force had done, or the British either. Simply put, Navy fighter pilots concentrated heavily on high-aspect gunnery. While everyone else trained with the gun from a tail aspect, the Navy worked very hard on what they called deflection shooting, this kind of aspect, and this made them extraordinarily effective at high-angle snapshots, and that skill was an important tool throughout the war. The F-4F was inferior to the Japanese Zero in a lot of ways, but with deflection shooting and its toughness, combined with teamwork, it largely made up for that in the coming battles. It actually did an amazing job, given the fact that the Zero was such a better performer. Some would think that 72 airplanes aboard the carrier could not be considered as a limited resource, but they were. The TBD was very much obsolete and could not integrate with the SPD or the Wildcat in any fashion. It was a 100-mile-an-hour airplane. Losses at Midway would end the combat life of the TBD Devastator, probably for the best. Definitely for the crews. There weren't enough fighters to defend the carrier and the fleet or any significant portion of the strike packages, much less go offensive against the enemy. This and the material deficiencies identified in the Enterprise After Action Report were significant positive lessons, even though it would be months before fixes were made to the fleet. The fighters still flew in 3-ship sections, primarily in 6-ship flights, divisions, although they often broke into 2-ship sections to fight as the British and the Germans were doing in Europe. There was no coordination between fighters and bombers and torpedo planes. The alpha strike of massed airplanes had yet to be adopted. Piecemeal attacks were the standard of the day, and the quickest launch was the overriding priority. Real results proved that, for the most part, strikes carried out by the Enterprise were not very effective. They just weren't. And the shock value of the strike was worth more than the actual damage. The 150-mile separation between the two carrier task force is a case in point. Enterprise launched multiple strikes against the same targets because they did not have the firepower to destroy any one target effectively. They were fortunate the Japanese were slow to react and mount a successful counterattack. The range between the carriers meant that they were not even capable of supporting each other if they got in trouble, much less coordinate an effective strike. They didn't even try. It wasn't a factor. And actually the same thing happened in Midway. There had been precious little training prior to wartime in combat operations. Training missions concentrated on particular tasks like air-to-air gunnery, some maneuvering from the fighters, and various bombing profiles for the SPDs and TVDs. There were no ship-wide training missions or workups, no large-scale launches, no coordinated attacks with other carriers. They had broken training into the most important chunks of a particular airplane's mission, and they practiced that. And they never put the whole thing together. Some pilots had not operated at night from a carrier, and some had not even qualified on carrier operations before departing on the mission. No kidding. In port, there was no emphasis on training to overcome these deficiencies. Later on, a few good guys would start working on that, Thatch being one of them. An example of the Enterprise Air Department would not allow fighters to practice gunnery training with a towed target sleeve while underway. Okay. Intelligence on the enemy was sadly lacking and would remain that way until much later in the war. They did what they could, but it was not good. The attack planning was interfered with by sink-packed Nimitz. Fundamentally, the U.S. Navy violated the principle of mass in the offensive, but they did so because their exercises, they glossed over that aspect of war. In other words, they had in their mind, this is how you fight, and it wasn't a good idea. They believed what they wanted to believe, and to be fair, the Japanese also suffered from this issue to a pretty strong degree. Their offensive nature made up a lot for that. One could say that actually the Japanese suffered from this far longer than the Americans did. The bottom line is that the U.S. Navy only learned a few of the all-important lessons they needed to be effective. Some serious lessons loom on the horizon. The old adage is that it's better to be lucky and good, and Halsey got away with it. Halsey got away with it. The weather protected Yorktown, but the price was high in airplanes and crewmen. The next combat we're going to review is the Battle of the Coral Sea. Again, mostly what I want to look at is the tactics, and rather than the actual battle and how it fit into the strategic calculation. We'll mention something like that, but mostly I want to look at the tactics and how it transpired. So I hope you liked the video and learned something about the U.S. Navy carriers and how they got started in World War II. If you did, hit like and subscribe. It looks like a bit like this here. And I'd also like to thank my Patreon supporters here. Without y'all, this would be infinitely harder. If you'd like to support the channel, I'll leave a link below for the Patreon Flywire channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Flywire.